I was driving back home after a long day, the low hum of the radio filling the silence in the car. My life was nothing extraordinary, just comfortable. At 55, I had a routine marriage, a quaint house, and the kind of stability people often say they envy. But lately, I'd been feeling like a supporting actress in my own story. My husband, Mark, was a good man, dependable and kind, but we had fallen into a pattern of quiet coexistence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the engine sputtered, jerking me out of my thoughts. I groaned, pulling the car to the side of the highway. My knowledge of cars was as good as my ability to fix them, non-existent. To make matters worse, my phone had no signal. Fantastic. I stepped out, the cool evening air wrapping around me, and leaned against the hood, staring hopelessly at the smoking engine. Then I heard the rumble of a truck pulling over behind me. A man stepped out, and for a moment, I was struck by how effortlessly he carried himself. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, dark hair, strong build, and a confident ease in the way he approached me. "You look like you could use some help," he said, his voice warm and casual. I hesitated. The thought of a stranger offering assistance on an empty highway sent my mind spinning through every crime documentary I'd ever watched. But his expression was open and kind, and frankly, I didn't have much choice. "I think it's the engine," I said, though I might as well have been describing quantum physics for all I knew. He chuckled, crouching to inspect the car. "Let's see what's going on here. I'm Ryan, by the way." "Margaret," I replied, watching him work. His hands moved with practiced ease, his brow furrowed in concentration. Within minutes, he had diagnosed the problem, a loose connection that he temporarily fixed with a tool from his truck. "You'll be able to drive, but you should swing by my shop tomorrow for a proper repair." "It's not far from here," he said, handing me a card. I took it, glancing at the name of the shop, Ryan's Auto Repairs. Simple and straightforward, like the man himself. "Thank you," I said, my gratitude genuine. "I don't know what I would have done without you." He shrugged, flashing a lopsided grin. "Happy to help. Drive safe, Margaret." As he pulled away, I sat in my car, staring at the card. There was something about Ryan's easy charm and quiet confidence that stayed with me. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but for the first time in a long while, I felt something stir inside me, an unfamiliar spark. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just a fleeting moment of admiration, nothing more. But that night, as I lay in bed next to Mark, the image of Ryan's smile refused to leave my mind. Why was I still thinking about him? The next morning, I woke up with a peculiar energy, the kind that made me feel like something was pulling me forward. I went about my usual routine, coffee, a brief chat with Mark before he left for work, and a few hours of reading, but my thoughts kept circling back to Ryan. It was silly. He was just a kind stranger who happened to help me out when I needed it most. But there was something about the way he looked at me, like I wasn't invisible. By mid-afternoon, I found myself standing in the driveway, holding the card he'd given me. The card definitely needed a proper fix. That was a fact. But deep down, I knew there was another reason I wanted to visit his shop. I convinced myself it was harmless, a quick trip to address the car issue. Nothing more. I grabbed my keys, slid into the driver's seat and headed out. The shop wasn't hard to find. A modest building with a big garage door, and a sign that simply read Ryan's Auto Repairs. As I pulled in, I spotted him immediately. He was leaning over the open hood of a car, his grease-streaked hands moving confidently as he worked. When he looked up and saw me, his face lit up with a smile that made my chest tighten. "Margaret," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Glad you came by. Did the temporary fix hold up?" I nodded, stepping out of the car. "It did, but I figured it's better to fix it properly." He gestured for me to pop the hood, and I watched as he began his inspection. Standing there in the sunlight, I couldn't help but notice how natural he looked in his element. "So, what do you do?" he asked, breaking the silence as he worked. "Me? Oh, I'll read a lot. Volunteer at the library sometimes." "Nothing exciting," I said, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Reading sounds exciting to me," he replied, glancing up. "What kind of books?" I smiled despite myself. "Mostly historical fiction. Sometimes mysteries. Any recommendations?" His question caught me off guard. Most people wouldn't bother asking about something so mundane. But Ryan wasn't most people. Was he? Well, There's this series set in World War II, I began, and before I knew it, we were talking about stories, characters, and places we both wanted to visit someday. As he finished with the car, I realized I hadn't felt this alive in years. The conversation flowed effortlessly, like we'd known each other forever. "Your car's good to go," he said finally, closing the hood. "How much do I owe you?" I asked, reaching for my purse. "Consider it a thank you for trusting me," he replied with a wink. I laughed, shaking my head. "You're too kind. But really, I insist." "Next time," he interrupted. "You can pay me next time." His words hung in the air as I drove home, my heart inexplicably lighter. Next time. Why did those words make me feel like I already couldn't wait? Was it wrong to feel this way? Over the following week, I tried to bury myself in routine. I volunteered extra hours at the library, reorganized our bookshelves at home, and even baked a pie for Mark's office potluck, something I hadn't done in years. Anything to keep my mind from wandering back to Ryan. But it was no use. The sound of his laugh, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the casual confidence he exuded, it all played in my mind like a song I couldn't get out of my head. I started to question myself. Was this just a harmless infatuation? A midlife fantasy sparked by a chance encounter? Or was it something more? A sign of something missing in my life that I'd been too afraid to confront? Mark didn't notice the shift in me. He came home late most nights, his mind buried in work. Our conversations were mechanical at best. Bills, schedules, the occasional comment about the weather. We had settled into a quiet companionship over the years, and I told myself that was enough. But Ryan had stirred something in me, something I thought was long gone. One evening, as I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty seat across from me, I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to see him again, if only to understand what this strange pull toward him meant. The next day, I found myself driving to the auto shop. My heart pounded in my chest as I parked and walked inside. Ryan was behind the counter, talking to another customer. When he saw me, his face lit up with that familiar smile. "Margaret," he said warmly. "Good to see you again." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks as the other customer glanced at me briefly before leaving. "I just wanted to thank you again for fixing the car," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Of course," he replied, leaning casually against the counter. "How's it running?" "Perfectly. Better than ever." He grinned. "Glad to hear it. So what brings you here today? Another car issue or—" I hesitated, fumbling for an answer. The truth was I didn't have a reason. Not one I could explain without sounding foolish. "I thought I'd bring you this." I held up a small package. A batch of cookies I'd baked that morning. His eyes softened. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to." "It's a thank you for your kindness," I said, feeling a little braver now. He took the package, his fingers brushing mine briefly. "This means a lot. Thank you." For a moment, we just stood there, the air between us charged with an unspoken energy. "You have some time?" he asked suddenly. "There's a coffee shop next door. I could use a break." I hesitated, the rational part of me screaming that this was crossing a line. But then he smiled, and the weight of all my doubts melted away. "I'd like that," I said, and we walked out together. As we sat at the cafe, talking and laughing like old friends, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just attraction or admiration, it was connection. And it scared me. How do you fight feelings that feel so right but come at the wrong time in your life? I walked back to my car after our coffee, my head buzzing. The conversation with Ryan had felt so effortless. He talked about growing up in a small town, how he'd gotten into fixing cars after learning from his dad, and his plans to eventually open his own shop. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it. His passion and openness reminded me of a younger version of myself, a time before life became so calculated and predictable. For the next few days, I replayed our conversation in my mind. I felt a mix of emotions: excitement, guilt, longing, and fear. I couldn't deny that I was drawn to him. But what did that say about me? Mark and I hadn't spoken much that week. He'd been late from work every night, too tired to do more than grunt responses to my questions. I started to resent the silence between us, the way we seemed to orbit the same space but never truly connect. One evening, Mark was working late again, and I found myself standing by the window, staring at the darkening sky. My phone buzzed on the counter and I glanced at it. It was a message from Ryan. "Thanks again for the cookies. You've got some serious baking skills. Thinking of trying my hand at it. Any tips?" I stared at the screen for a moment, my heart racing. A simple message, innocent enough, but I couldn't ignore the warmth it brought me. I typed back, "Start with something simple. Chocolate chip is always a winner. And don't overmix the dough." The response came quickly. "Noted. Think I could get a lesson from the expert someday." I laughed softly to myself, a sound that felt foreign after so many days of tension. Before I could overthink it, I typed, "If you're serious, I'd be happy to." The next day, he showed up at my house. I convinced myself it was innocent, just two people bonding over cookies. But as soon as I saw him standing on my doorstep, the weight of what I was doing hit me. "Margaret," he said, holding up a bag of flour and a carton of eggs with a sheepish grin. I came prepared. I laughed, stepping aside to let him in. "I see that. Let's get started." We spent the next hour in the kitchen, mixing dough and talking about everything from childhood memories to our favorite movies. There was something so natural about being around him, like we'd known each other forever. At one point, I caught him watching me as I rolled out the dough. His gaze was soft, almost tender, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Margaret," he said quietly, breaking the comfortable hum of our conversation. "You ever just feel like you're in the right place at the right time?" I paused, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then smiled, shaking his head. "Never mind. It's probably the sugar talking." But I knew what he meant. I felt it too. That night, after he left, I sat in the quiet of my living room, grappling with the reality of what was happening. Was I looking for an escape from the monotony of my life? Or was Ryan awakening something I'd buried long ago? Could it be both? And if it was, how far was I willing to let this go? Have you ever found yourself standing at a crossroads, knowing that either path could redefine who you are? The following days felt like a haze, a whirlwind of emotions that I could neither control nor fully understand. I kept going over Ryan's words, the way he looked at me, how effortlessly he made me feel seen and valued. The connection was undeniable, but every time I thought about it, a wave of guilt washed over me. I'd never imagined myself in this position. Married for over 30 years, my life with Mark had always been a steady routine. Sure, we'd hit bumps along the way, but I never thought I would question my commitment to him, until now. As I sat in the living room one afternoon, waiting for Mark to come home from another late shift, I thought about everything that had happened. Ryan was more than just a man who fixed cars. He represented a spark I hadn't felt in years. I hadn't realized how much I'd been craving attention, affection, and connection until he'd come into my life. But I couldn't ignore the reality. Ryan was young. Too young. He had his whole life ahead of him, while I was tied to my past, to Mark. What would people think? What would my children say if they found out? I found myself obsessing over the implications of it all. Would I be labeled as a fool for chasing after someone half my age? Could this really turn into something meaningful? Or was it just a fleeting fantasy? A way for me to feel alive again. The moment of reckoning came when Ryan sent me a message that afternoon. "I was thinking of you today. It's funny how someone can change the way you see things, even when you least expect it." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't deny the way his words made me feel. But the reality of what I was about to do, or maybe already had done, began to sink in. I couldn't keep this up forever. I wasn't sure what was driving me. Was it the thrill of something forbidden, the emotional connection I craved, or the attention that had been lacking in my marriage? I decided to take a step back. I couldn't let this consume me, couldn't allow myself to get in too deep. Mark needed me. I owed him more than this. But was I also denying my own happiness by suppressing something that felt so real, even if it was complicated and messy? The next time Ryan messaged me, I hesitated before replying. I told myself it was for the best, that I should focus on my marriage and stop fantasizing about something that was never meant to be. "Thank you for everything, Ryan. But I think I need some space to think about things." I sent the message and immediately felt a pang of regret. Maybe I had just let go of something that could have been wonderful. Maybe, by trying to protect my own life and my marriage, I had shut myself off from something that could change everything. But could I really walk away from Ryan, Walk away from that feeling of being seen, of being wanted? What would you do in my position? Do we hold on to what's comfortable, or take a chance on something new? Even when it feels impossible, the days following my message to Ryan were filled with uncertainty. I stayed busy, immersing myself in household chores, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that lingered in my mind. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, that feeling, the magnetic pull toward Ryan, wouldn't go away. It was a constant hum, like the faint sound of a melody I couldn't get out of my head. Mark seemed oblivious to my inner turmoil. He was still working long hours, and when he was home, we fell into our usual routines. He'd talk about his day, about the new clients at the firm, and I'd listen, nodding, pretending to care. I wasn't proud of it, but I couldn't help but feel disconnected. My mind wandered to Ryan again. The way he had looked at me so genuinely, the warmth in his voice. I realized that even in the silence of my marriage, Ryan had somehow brought color back into my life. But the guilt kept creeping back in. I couldn't help but feel like I was living a double life. Every time I saw Mark, every time I answered his questions with a smile and pretended everything was fine, I felt like a fraud. And yet, when I thought of Ryan, my chest tightened with anticipation. I had thought I could walk away, but here I was, still thinking about him every waking moment. I found myself checking my phone more often than usual, hoping for a message from him, but there was nothing. It was as if he had respected my need for space. But was that what I truly wanted? One evening I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my car keys almost on impulse and drove to the mechanic shop. It wasn't about the car anymore. It was about him. It was about the way I felt when I was near him. Alive, seen, desired. It was something I hadn't felt in years, and I wasn't ready to let it go. When I walked into the shop, Ryan was there working on a car. He looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment before he smiled. It was a hesitant smile, the kind that told me he was unsure of what I was doing there. I felt my heart race as I approached. I didn't mean to interrupt, I said, my voice shaking slightly. No interruption, he replied, his voice steady. I'm glad you stopped by. There was a moment of silence as he wiped his hands on a rag, then glanced back at me. I thought about what you said about needing space. I nodded, unable to speak. He didn't seem upset, more thoughtful, almost understanding. But the weight of the moment hung between us. The attraction, the chemistry, it was still there, palpable, as strong as ever. I've been thinking a lot about us too, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. And I don't know what this is or what we are, or where it's going. He stepped closer, his gaze intense but kind. I didn't mean to complicate things for you, Ellie. I can't help how I feel. And just like that, I felt a crack in my resolve. I had thought that avoiding him would make everything easier, that distance would quiet the voice in my head. But being here in front of him, all those feelings came rushing back. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath shallow as I realized just how much I missed being around him. Do you want to talk? He asked, his voice soft, almost too gentle. The truth was, I wasn't sure I could talk. Not about what was going on inside me. Not about the conflict that raged in my mind between what was right and what felt right. But I also knew that, in this moment, talking might be the only way forward. I nodded. Yes, but I'm scared, Ryan. Scared of what this means. Scared of what people might think. But also scared of walking away from something that makes me feel alive. He didn't say anything at first, just took a step closer, his hand brushing mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. It was a touch that told me everything I needed to know. I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. But I want you to know. I'm here. And I'll wait for you to figure this out. I don't want to push you, Ellie. I just want you to be happy. Whatever that means. I stood there, my mind racing, torn between my life with Mark and this new, unpredictable connection with Ryan. It wasn't just about the physical attraction anymore, it was something deeper, something more profound. But could I take that step? Could I cross that line? Thank you, Ryan, I said softly, my voice trembling. You've already done more for me than you'll ever know. He smiled, and for a moment, everything felt right. But as I turned to leave, the uncertainty loomed large. Was I ready to make a change? To follow this unexpected feeling, even if it meant challenging everything I'd known? The question lingered in the air long after I drove away. The answer still uncertain, but slowly becoming clearer with every passing day. The days following my encounter with Ryan were filled with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. I found myself replaying every moment over and over in my mind. The way he had touched my hand, the warmth in his eyes when he said he'd wait for me, the way he made me feel like I mattered again, like I wasn't invisible, just another middle-aged woman stuck in the routine of her life. But even as my heart raced every time I thought about him, a heavy sense of guilt weighed me down. Mark, my husband of nearly 30 years, was still clueless. He was absorbed in his work as usual, and I continued to play my part as a dutiful wife. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was lying to him. Every smile I gave him, every "I'm fine" I uttered, felt like a betrayal. I wasn't fine. Not anymore. I couldn't help but feel trapped. My emotions, my desires, they didn't fit into the life I had built. I had spent so many years with Mark, sharing everything from the mundane to the intimate. We had built a life together, a home, memories that couldn't be erased. But Ryan was different. He was fresh, untainted by the years of shared history. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in ages. But how could I ever choose him over Mark? How could I throw away everything I had worked for? I spent that entire week in a fog, unable to focus on anything. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to reason with myself. I'd come up with a dozen excuses not to call Ryan back, but none of them felt right. I couldn't keep pretending that I wasn't drawn to him. One evening, Mark came home early. His face was tense, his brow furrowed in concern. "Ellie, we need to talk," he said, setting down his briefcase and walking toward me. I could feel my pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I knew he'd sense something. Maybe it was the way I had been avoiding him, or perhaps the distance between us had finally become too much for him to ignore. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "I don't know, something's different with you. You've been distant lately. Are you okay? You're not happy, are you?" His voice was soft, but there was an edge of worry in it that I hadn't heard in a long time. I swallowed hard. I wanted to tell him the truth, to admit that I had been living a lie, that I had fallen for someone else. But the words caught in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to break his heart. "Not like this." "I'm fine," I said, my voice cracking slightly as I forced a smile. "Just tired. Work, you know how it is." He didn't buy it. He stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm, searching my face for some sign that everything was okay. "Ellie," he said quietly, "you don't have to lie to me. I know something's off. You've been avoiding me, and I can feel the distance growing. If something's wrong, you can tell me." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't keep lying, not to him, not to myself. But how could I say it out loud? How could I admit that I wasn't just tired, that I wasn't just stressed, that I had found something in someone else, someone younger, that had awakened a part of me I thought had been dormant for years? I pulled away from him, suddenly feeling suffocated. "I don't know what's wrong, Mark. I'm not sure of anything anymore," I said, my voice trembling with frustration. "Not sure of what?" His tone was sharp now, his confusion turning into something else, something more fearful. "Not sure of us," I whispered, unable to look him in the eye. "Not sure of who I am anymore." He was silent for a moment, processing my words. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I see." I could tell he was hurt, but I could also see the flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew something had changed. Maybe he didn't know the specifics, but he knew I wasn't the same person I had been when we first married. "I don't want to lose you, Ellie," he said quietly. "But if you're not happy, if you feel like you're not the person you want to be, then I want you to find that person. I don't want to stand in your way." Those words, though spoken with kindness, felt like a bomb dropped at my feet. It wasn't what I had expected. I had imagined this conversation going in a completely different direction. I had thought he would beg me to stay, to reassure me that we could work things out. But he didn't. He was giving me the freedom to choose. But could I choose? Could I choose Ryan? Could I walk away from Mark after all these years? I could feel the weight of the decision pressing on me, threatening to crush me. But I couldn't ignore the pull I felt toward Ryan. I couldn't pretend that this feeling would just go away. "I need some time to think," I said, the words barely escaping my lips. Mark nodded, his face full of resignation. "Take all the time you need." As he walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment that everything in my life was about to change. Could I finally embrace what I had been too afraid to acknowledge for so long? Or was I about to lose everything for the sake of something fleeting, something that could never be? The uncertainty of what lay ahead hung in the air like a heavy fog, and I knew that the choice I made next would shape the rest of my life. The days that followed that conversation were a blur. Mark gave me space, and I could feel the strain between us, a silence that stretched longer than any argument ever could. We both knew something was broken, but neither of us could say what it was. I spent hours in the quiet of our home, wondering what it all meant. The life I had known for over 3 decades suddenly felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and I had no idea how to stop it. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, turning over every word Mark had said. He had given me the freedom to choose, to find myself again. But the weight of that freedom was heavier than I ever anticipated. The realization that I could leave everything behind, that I could truly step into a new chapter of my life, was terrifying. I felt as though I was on the edge of something vast and unknown, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to take the leap. But then there was Ryan. Ryan had texted me a couple of times after our last encounter, checking in to see how I was doing. Each message from him felt like a breath of fresh air. He wasn't just the charming mechanic I had met by the side of the road. He was someone who saw me, really saw me for the first time in years. He didn't just acknowledge my appearance. He acknowledged the parts of me that I had long ignored. The parts that had been buried under the weight of responsibility, of duty, and of an unremarkable routine. He made me feel alive, like I wasn't invisible anymore. One afternoon, after days of internal conflict, I decided to go to Ryan's shop again. I told myself it was just to get my car checked one last time, but deep down I knew it was more than that. It was a chance to see him again, to feel the spark that had been ignited between us. As I drove to his shop, my heart raced in a way it hadn't in years. I parked my car and took a deep breath before walking inside. Ryan was there, as always, with his easy smile and that warm, welcoming energy. "Ellie, hey, it's good to see you again," he said, his voice light and full of genuine warmth. I smiled, feeling a flutter in my chest. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Not at all. Always happy to see you," he said, his eyes twinkling. "What brings you by today?" I thought I'd get that repair you mentioned," I said, my voice a little softer than I intended. He raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing there was more to my visit than just the car. "Sure, I can take care of that. But if you're not in a rush, we could grab a coffee after? There's this little cafe down the road." I hesitated for a moment, but only a moment. Something inside me, some quiet voice, urged me to take the step, to embrace the possibility of something more than just a fleeting moment. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's go." We left the shop together, and as we walked to the cafe, I felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. It felt easy, so easy, like we had known each other far longer than just a few brief encounters. The conversation flowed effortlessly, as if we were picking up a thread that had been left hanging for years. We talked about everything, our lives, our hopes, our regrets. But beneath it all, there was a magnetic pull that neither of us could deny. As we sat at the small table, sipping our drinks, I felt my walls begin to crumble. I couldn't keep pretending that this was just about the car, that this was just some harmless flirtation. There was something real here, something undeniable. He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "Ellie," he said, his voice low, almost reverent, "I'm not asking you to make any decisions. But I want you to know, I care about you. I care about you in a way I've never cared about anyone before." The words hit me like a wave, crashing over me and sweeping away all the uncertainty. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to just feel. I didn't have to figure everything out. I didn't need to make sense of it. I just had to be present. "I care about you too, Ryan," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of the truth. "But I'm scared. I'm scared of what this means, what it might cost." "I'm scared too," he said, squeezing my hand gently. "But I think we deserve to see where this could go. I don't want to rush anything, Ellie. But I also don't want to let this slip away. I looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation. But all I saw was sincerity, a depth of emotion that mirrored my own. I don't know what's going to happen, I said, my voice shaking with emotion. But I want to try. We sat there for a long time, the noise of the cafe fading into the background as we shared a quiet moment of understanding. It wasn't just about age or circumstance or the judgments of others. It was about connection, about two people finding something real in each other, despite the world's expectations. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what my future held. But for the first time in years, I felt alive, I felt free. And that, in itself, was worth everything. As I left the cafe, hand in hand with Ryan, I didn't know where this would lead, but I knew one thing for sure. I was finally ready to embrace whatever came next. Love, at any age, was worth the risk, and I was willing to take it.